Welcome to Our Canada, Our Future. I'm Aaron Woodrick. On today's show, we're going to be talking about a recent paper published talking about the crisis of viewpoint diversity in universities. And to talk about that, I'm very pleased to be joined by one of the authors of that paper, Zacharay Patterson, who's an associate professor of engineering at Concordia University in Montreal. Zach, thank you so much for taking the time to join me today.
Thanks very much for giving us the opportunity, Aaron.
Zach, so, we hear a lot these days about the importance of diversity generally, but less about perhaps viewpoint diversity. So I'm wondering if perhaps that's the reason that you decided to partner with Professor Dummett to explore this issue.
I'm not sure it was exactly the issue of viewpoint diversity, but it was kind of a broader issue. We undertook it more on account of reports from the US and UK about concerns related to academic freedom, particularly hostile climates for political minorities, something that's been associated with political homogeneity in universities. But whenever the issue is brought up in Canada, there are debates around about the degree to which universities in Canada are either politically homogenous or whether there's a hostile climate for political minorities here. And so we basically wanted to try to come up with some data to get to the bottom of that.
I see. So you were trying to quantify something to contribute to the debate, of course, because if you see studies in other countries, we can kind of measure it. But you're saying there wasn't any equivalent here in Canada. And so this was an attempt to sort of quantify this discussion?
That's right. So not for a very long time in Canada. More recently, Eric Kaufman, who's actually a Canadian but based in the United Kingdom, did a report and did some surveys, but they were quite small sample sizes. Only around 300 professors responded to the survey. So we thought it would be interesting to take a closer look with larger sample sizes.
Interesting. Now, in the report, ironically, you outlined some of the challenges that almost prevented you from even doing this in the first place. So, what do you make of that? And can you sort of explain what happened there?
Well, basically, when we first sent the survey out, there were people who reacted publicly on Twitter and on Facebook, tried to organize people to not respond to it, and there were even complaints made to both our universities that we were undertaking this study.
Wow. And is this a common occurrence with academic surveys? I mean, it seems to me that even the objection to even asking questions seems a little bit strange.
It was surprising to me. I've done quite a bit of survey work in the past, more related to my central expertise, and I've never seen anything like that. I was very surprised.
Well, maybe we can get into what your study actually concluded. Can you sort of summarize in a minute or so what did your study find about viewpoint diversity at universities?
Absolutely. So when I was speaking before, I really was talking about political homogeneity and hostile climates. So the main conclusions on those fronts are that universities in Canada do seem to be quite politically homogenous, with well over 80% of professors self-identifying with the political left. And in terms of hostile climate, there is, many professors experience a hostile climate, and it's not the same depending on where you are on the political spectrum. On the right, around 40% of professors experience hostile climates in their departments, whereas on the left, about 14% experience hostile climates. In addition to that, if we think about what the hostile climate can imply, often it's that people are worried about negative repercussions about their actions or the things that they might say. And so one of the things that we concluded or found in the study was that 44% of professors on the right were concerned about negative repercussions just if their political views were known, whereas this was not the same. It was asymmetrical, where only 12% of those on the left were concerned about that.
Interesting. And your study also, I know, talks about self-censorship. And I'm curious, for people who might not understand, what would that look like in the university context?
Well, self-censorship, basically is people refraining from expressing their views, say in departmental meetings, and it can go as far, perhaps most concerningly, in the topics that people choose to research and whether or not they decide to research them. And it turns out that 57% of those on the political right have refrained from airing such views, pursuing research in that direction, whereas only 34% on the left have.
Very interesting. Okay. Well, a lot more to dig into here. We're going to take a very short break and be right back after these messages. Welcome back to Our Canada, Our Future. We're talking about viewpoint diversity in universities with Zach Patterson of Concordia University. Zach, we're talking about the paper that you co-authored exploring the what you call a viewpoint diversity crisis in Canada's universities. I'm curious, how do your findings compare to what we've seen with similar research done in other countries, and whether or not there's viewpoint diversity issues in universities in other countries?
So, in terms of what's been found elsewhere and what we find, our results largely corroborate what's been found elsewhere. And when I speak of elsewhere, it's really the work from the United States, the United Kingdom, a lot of which has also been done by Eric Kaufman, who I mentioned before. So that is, I'm not sure if it's comforting or not, but it's interesting that we seem to be experiencing similar things in Canada as in the US and the UK. One thing that is different, however, in our report and in Canada is that there seems to be more homogeneity, political homogeneity between the disciplines. So in other countries, it's been found that STEM, for example, it tends to skew less towards the left than other disciplines. But in our study, all the disciplines that we looked at, or the way that we aggregated them, skewed to the left almost to the same amount, especially if we can think about confidence intervals.
Interesting. Now, I guess some of the objections that have been raised, the first one, Zach, might be, well, haven't universities always leaned to the left? I get a lot of people would say, well, is it surprising to find that universities, which have long been considered sort of liberal or progressive leaning, is it really a surprise that we're seeing, such a high ratio of faculty identifying with the left? Is this really a new development or anything that should surprise us?
Well, whether or not it should surprise us, I'm not exactly sure. I think the question might be the degree to which it's changing or not. And it's interesting. Our study it's a little bit complicated in that dimension because we do have some historical information, and the historical information looks like, all told, as you measure it, the voting intentions, if you divide it left-right, are about the same as they have been in the past. And so we talk about this a little bit in the report. One of the things that we think may have changed in Canada is basically the political, where the Liberal Party is situated on the political spectrum. With a sense, I think there's a lot of evidence that the political place of the Liberal Party in Canada is much further to the left than it was the last time there was good data on this.
Interesting. And is it also the case, because I know you've asked other questions in your study besides where people consider themselves on the political spectrum. For example, people who would be comfortable, with silencing voices based on their political orientation. Is it fair to say that, historically, even people who were on the left, were still quite vigorous defenders of, for example, the principle of free speech? Whereas today, if you are on the political left, at least according to the survey, there seems to be a higher propensity or willingness to silence free speech if views don't align with your own.
So that's interesting, Aaron. That's actually kind of two dimensions there: a historical dimension and the degree for support of traditional liberal values, let's say, over time, and then what the situation is now. So we can't really comment on what's happened over time. In our report, we do ask questions. I think the most appropriate question here is the question on whether or not you would think it was acceptable to discriminate in a hiring decision against someone if on the political right or on the political left. And so we asked both people on the right and on the left, and it turns out that the 14% of people on the left would support it if the candidate were on the right, but the opposite situation where progressives on the right discriminating against people on the left, that rate is only 5%. So there seems to be less of a temptation, let's say, to discriminate against those of a different political suasion for those on the right than on the left. So I think that's something that's concerning, especially given the high proportion of professors who are on the left.
Yeah, and that's interesting because you would think that a principle like that, by definition, should be applied consistently. So either you discriminate; it's okay to discriminate based on, political view or not. Not, oh, you can if it's the wrong political view, but not if it's the right one.
Yeah, and I think that, I mean, that consistency issue is right, and I should have probably mentioned it, but because if you look at the other question the other way around, it turns out that people on the left wouldn't want to discriminate against people on the left naturally. But those numbers are about the same on the left and the right. So the 5% on the right discriminating against the left is about the same as people on the left willing to discriminate against people on the left.
Interesting stuff. Well, we're going to take a short break and be right back. We're talking about the viewpoint diversity crisis in Canada's universities with Zacharay Patterson, Concordia University, who co-authored a paper on the subject. Zach, we talked about some of what your study found. I wanted to sort of turn to what your theories might be about how this came about. How did we get to this point where we have this viewpoint diversity crisis? Do you have any sort of theories or insight as to how long this took to develop and what the causes of it were?
Well, the best explanation I've heard for it comes from Jonathan. You might know he's written a lot on this topic, on viewpoint diversity, and he founded the Heterodox Academy, which funded this report actually. But his explanation is kind of twofold. First off, as you mentioned before, universities had always been left leaning, and that was the case up until the Second World War, where I think it was 2/3 left, 1/3 right, something like that. And then what happened was with the Vietnam era, there were many people on the left who wanted, in order to stay out of the war, they stayed in school and they continued in higher education. And as a result, there were more professors of a leaning left that were brought into the university afterwards. And then after that, it was basically a positive feedback loop. And I think this part of positive feedback loop, you can understand it when you look at these. The numbers that we were talking about before, the willingness to discriminate against people of a different political persuasion.
Interesting. What are your thoughts too on the role of university administration? I know your survey is about professors, of course, and they're the focus of the survey. They're the ones that answer the questions. But there's been a lot of discussion or theorizing about the role of administration, and that since universities have seen a considerable growth in the size of their administration, and that in fact the people who take on those roles are also heavily lean left. And do you think that has an impact on the sort of the academic environment generally?
So that's an interesting question. I've seen those reports as well, suggesting that people in the upper administrations tend to skew even more towards the left than the general professoriate. It might be just part of that same positive feedback loop. As people come into the university, it becomes, the professoriate itself becomes increasingly towards one political persuasion. They move into the higher levels of the administration, and it's just part of the positive feedback loop. But our report we didn't collect any information like that.
Yeah, fair enough. Maybe you can turn to some of the objections or sort of disagreements with the report that we've seen. Some people have argued that there is no crisis. That not all views are equally worthy of airtime, and that it's sort of it's diversity for its own sake is not valuable in a university environment. So what do you say to that argument?
Well, I'd actually say that it's quite a concerning and dangerous position, since free expression and free speech is the bedrock of a liberal society. It's something that in the past has served to protect political minorities and allow them to express ideas and make their case in the court of public opinion. It's allowed ideas that were once considered taboo that are now considered hallmarks of modern liberal society, and it's allowed them to become commonplace. So preventing people from being able to express those ideas, I think, is concerning. And secondly, I think it's important to recognize that suppressing the free expression of ideas can actually lead to cycles of what's called confirmation bias, people just hearing opinions with which they agree, and it can lead to difficulties in trying to approach the truth. And in fact, it short circuits our whole epistemological approach to the modern world.
Yes, fair point. Some people have raised, some critics would argue that your paper, the way that the methodology, you overrepresented certain disciplines such as social sciences, and so that doesn't give an accurate picture of the state of affairs in universities. What do you say to that?
Well, yeah. So it seems that our sample does overrepresent the humanities and the social sciences while underrepresenting STEM. And but there's interesting aspects of that and its impact on whether it exaggerates or whether it actually understates the patterns that we've seen. So first of all, we show that political skew is quite similar across the disciplines. It's almost the same, and certainly within the margins of error. And as it turns out, if we look, this isn't in the report, but when we look a bit more closely at the questions related to support for cancellation, for example, it looks like the STEM respondents were actually more likely to support cancellation than respondents from the other disciplines. So putting all that together, what it looks like more is that it doesn't look like there's underrepresentation, or sorry, it doesn't look like the underrepresentation of the STEM scholars exaggerates our findings. If anything, it looks like it might understate it.
Welcome back to Our Canada, Our Future. We're talking about the Viewpoint diversity crisis in universities with Zacharay Patterson, who's a professor at Concordia University. Zach, just before the break, we were talking a bit about criticism of your study about maybe perhaps overrepresenting certain disciplines, and I wanted to give you a chance to sort of respond to that. You'd already argued that, for example, STEM disciplines actually were perhaps, because of the weighting, they were actually understating the crisis, but I think you had another point about the methodology that you wanted to raise.
Well, it just three aspects make us think that the report, if anything, understates and doesn't exaggerate the patterns that we've observed. One is this issue around the underrepresentation of STEM scholars. The other is, like I mentioned at the very beginning, these attempts, organized campaigns to ask people not to participate. And this were clearly organized kind of from criticizing us for being on the right, for asking the questions and asking members that were on the left not to respond to it at all. So we think that there is maybe an under participation from the left. And the another kind of fine point is that one of the categories of the professors, we have different ranks of professors, associate, assistant, full professor. There was an other category, and that other category was slightly overrepresented, but more moderate in their views. So if it were properly accounted for, then it would probably lead to an increase in the patterns that we've seen.
Interesting. Okay. Well, your paper argues we have a problem, so maybe we could turn to, in the last few minutes we have, how do we go about fixing this problem? What are some of the things that you've proposed in this paper that we can do to go about fixing this crisis?
Well, I think ultimately it's about a stronger commitment to academic freedom in the country and at our universities. We talk in particular in policy terms about an Academic Freedom Act that would be modeled on something similar to what they have recently passed in the United Kingdom. And that ultimately is an organization for an ombudsperson that would be able to receive complaints about breaches of academic freedom and then would have the teeth to be able to encourage people to allow freedom of expression. And another aspect related to that is an insistence on the political neutrality of universities and their instances like departments, so that we wouldn't have universities taking political positions that could restrict or influence the types of research and things that faculty express.
Interesting, because I can already think of some objections to those two solutions. I mean, maybe we can start first with the neutrality of universities. In a lot of cases, these professors were people who were very passionate about their views, and I think they might view it as an obligation almost to speak out. So do you think it's reasonable to expect universities to, in this day and age, remain politically neutral?
Well, I think there's a distinction between the university and the professor. And academic freedom itself is really something that is for professors and not for universities. So university professors should be allowed based on academic freedom to express whatever they think to be right or true. And if that involves taking political sides or positions or supporting elements of a political position, obviously that is part of academic freedom. I'm just talking about the institutions themselves, universities.
Right.
It's not really their role to take political positions, because if a university takes political position, it means that the freedom of the academics itself is hindered. There are things that they won't explore, questions they won't ask on account of having either the university itself or departments taking positions on issues that people would otherwise explore.
We've got just about 30 seconds left, so I just wanted to quickly ask, are we getting ourselves into hot water if we're asking the government, essentially, through its proxy, the ombudsperson, to police, essentially, academic freedom? Does that not itself open up some cans of worms?
Well, so, now we're on a debate about almost on the libertarian side of the right end of the spectrum. And I think that there are certainly concerns that could be raised like that. But at the same time, we have to remember that our institutions, the institutions of freedom of expression more broadly, don't happen in a vacuum. They can't happen without support to allow people to have those positive rights of freedom of expression. And I think this just goes in that general direction.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, it's been a fascinating discussion. Zach, thank you very much for joining us today. And I want to thank you, the viewers, for joining us. And we'll see you next time on Our Canada, Our Future.